It was a bright Monday morning in Ouagadougou, the capital of Burkina Faso. The sun rose gently above the city, casting golden light over the rooftops. At the presidential palace, the guards stood tall and alert as President Ibrahim Traoré stepped out, dressed simply in a neat dark brown shirt and trousers. He looked calm but determined. Unlike other days filled with long meetings and official duties, this day was different. President Traoré had a plan, one he had shared with no one except his driver. He wanted to visit the central prison without warning, no press, no media, no preparation, just himself and his heart. "Drive me to the prison," he told his driver. "I want to see how the people in there are living. No one must know." The driver was shocked but didn't ask questions. He nodded and started the engine. The black presidential vehicle left the palace quietly, escorted by only 2 plain police cars. About 40 minutes later, the car stopped in front of the largest prison in the city, Ouagadougou's Central Correctional Facility. It was a dusty place surrounded by high gray walls topped with barbed wire. The guards at the gate were confused when they saw who was in the car. The president of the country was standing at their gate like an ordinary visitor. "Mr. President," one of them stammered, quickly opening the gate. We were not informed." "I know," President Traoré replied firmly. "That is why I came. Take me inside." The prison warden, a short man named Monsieur Pascal, came rushing to greet him, sweating heavily. "Sir, if only we had known, we would have prepared." "I'm not here for preparation," the president said, walking past him. "Take me to the prisoners. I want to speak with them." Still confused, Pascal obeyed. He led President Traoré down a narrow hallway filled with echoes of footsteps and the distant sounds of coughing, shouting, and sorrow. The smell was strong, dust, sweat, and hopelessness hung in the air. As the president entered the main prison block, hundreds of inmates stopped whatever they were doing. Some were sitting on the floor playing cards, others were lying down looking tired, a few were praying silently. One by one, they stood up, surprised, confused, and amazed. The president greeted them humbly, shaking hands and asking them questions. "How long have you been here? What crime were you accused of? Do you have family?" Most of the prisoners responded with fear, unsure if this was a trick or a miracle. But the president listened patiently, his eyes meeting each man's eyes with kindness and respect. After an hour of moving from cell to cell, something happened. The president noticed a man sitting quietly in the corner of a small, dark cell. The man was not talking like the others. He wasn't even standing. His head was bowed, and his face was tired. He looked like someone who had lost everything. President Traoré walked closer and stopped in front of him. "What is your name?" he asked. The man looked up slowly, his eyes filled with pain and sadness. "Emmanuel," he said softly. "How long have you been here, Emmanuel?" 7 years, sir." "What was your crime?" Emmanuel swallowed hard. "They said I stole money from my boss, but I didn't. I worked for him for many years. He accused me because he wanted to get rid of me and hire his nephew. I had no lawyer. No one believed me. I am a poor man." The president looked into Emmanuel's eyes. Something about him was different. There was no hate, no bitterness, just quiet pain, the kind that comes from being abandoned and wrongly judged. "Why didn't you appeal?" I tried, Emmanuel whispered. But I have no money. My wife left me. My children were taken away. No one visited me in all these years. A deep silence filled the room. The other prisoners listened. Even the prison guards were quiet. Everyone could see that the president was moved. President Traoré stood there for a long time, then finally spoke. I believe you, Emmanuel. The warden gasped. Mr. President, I said I believe him, the president repeated. And I will find out the truth. Turning to the guards, he gave an order. Bring me his case file before the end of today. I want every detail: who arrested him, who judged the case, and who was the accuser. Everything. Yes, sir, they answered quickly. Then he looked at Emmanuel again and said, Your story is not over. I give you my word. As he walked out of the prison block, every prisoner stood in silence. Something had changed in the air. Hope, which had been buried for so long, began to rise again. Outside the prison, the president told his driver, Cancel my meetings today. I am going to the Ministry of Justice. Oh, but sir, no excuses. A man's life is waiting. And with that, the black vehicle drove off once more, this time, not just carrying a president, but a mission of justice. President Ibrahim Traoré sat silently in his office at the Ministry of Justice. The air conditioner hummed softly, but it couldn't cool the heat felt in his chest. Emmanuel's face refused to leave his mind. Those eyes, tired but honest, haunted him. He had met thousands of people, shaken hands with leaders from around the world, but there was something different about that man. Get me the Chief Justice, he said firmly to his aide. I want him here now. The aide nodded and rushed out. Moments later, Justice Minister Duff arrived, adjusting his tie nervously. He knew this wasn't a regular meeting. The president looked serious, too serious. Mr. President, you asked to see me urgently, he said, trying to sound calm. Yes, Traoré replied. I visited Ouagadougou's central prison this morning. I met a man named Emmanuel. He has been locked up for 7 years for a crime he insists he didn't commit. Duff hesitated. Sir, the courts failed him, Traoré said sharply. His case must be reopened. I want to know who judged it, who arrested him, and why he had no legal support. This is not just about Emmanuel. It's about how many more like him may be suffering in silence. Yes, sir, Duff said, lowering his eyes. I'll personally go through his case file. Not just you, Traoré said. Set up a fresh team, independent eyes, no politics, no games. I want truth and justice. Within hours, a small task force of honest lawyers and human rights officers was formed. They began digging into Emmanuel's file. What they found was shocking. The case was handled by a corrupt judge who had been dismissed years ago for accepting bribes. Emmanuel's employer, a wealthy businessman named Laurent Gera, had used his influence to speed up the trial. No lawyer had defended Emmanuel, and the only evidence against him was a poorly written statement one Emmanuel claimed he was forced to sign under threat. This is terrible, said one of the officers. The man was framed. The whole trial was a setup. That evening, the president received the full report. He read every line carefully. When he reached the end, he He closed the file slowly and whispered, "I knew he was telling the truth." The next morning, he returned to the prison, this time with cameras and reporters. The nation watched in shock as President Traoré entered Emmanuel's cell again, this time with hope in his eyes. "Emmanuel," he said warmly, "I have read your file. You were not only wrongly accused, you were abandoned by a system that should have protected you." "I'm sorry." Emmanuel blinked, confused. "Sir, you are going home," the president said. "Today." Gasps echoed around the prison. Emmanuel looked around like he was dreaming. "Is this real?" he asked, tears welling in his eyes. "Yes, it is," Traoré said. "You're a free man." A crowd had gathered outside the prison by the time Emmanuel stepped out. He looked thinner, older, and unsure. He held no bag. He had nothing. But the sun that fell on his face that day was not the same sun that shone when he entered prison 7 years ago. Reporters rushed toward him. "How do you feel, sir? What will you do now?" Emmanuel looked down at his hands, then up at the sky. "I don't know," he said softly. "I have no family, no house, no job. But I have hope. That's enough for now." President Traoré placed a hand on his shoulder. "You are not alone." He took Emmanuel into his official car and drove him to the presidential guest house. For the first time in years, Emmanuel bathed with clean water, ate real food, and slept on a soft bed. The next day, President Traoré invited him to the palace. "I want to hear everything," he said. "Your childhood, your job, your dreams." Emmanuel told him about growing up in a small village, how he worked hard as a clerk, how he married young, and how everything crumbled when he was arrested. "I wanted to be a teacher," he said. "But life had other plans." The president nodded. "Well, life has changed again, and this time you're in charge." Emmanuel smiled faintly, the first real smile in years. That afternoon, President Traoré called a press conference. He stood before cameras and said, "Today, we correct a mistake. But this is not just about one man. We must fix a broken system. No citizen should suffer in silence. I will not rest until our justice system protects the innocent and punishes the guilty fairly." He turned to Emmanuel, who stood beside him in borrowed clothes, his hands shaking. "Meet Emmanuel. He is not a criminal. He is a survivor, and he is now part of a new task force to help us investigate other wrongful imprisonments across the country." The crowd burst into applause. Emmanuel's eyes filled with tears again, but this time they were tears of hope. And just like that, a man forgotten by the world became a symbol of justice and change in Burkina Faso. The news spread across Burkina Faso like wildfire. Every newspaper, radio station, and TV channel carried the same headline: "President Traoré frees innocent man after surprise prison visit." But for President Ibrahim Traoré, Emmanuel's release was just the beginning. "Call for a national audit," he told Minister Diouf the next morning. "I want the files of every prisoner who has served more than 5 years, especially those without legal support." "Yes, sir," Diouf said, though clearly overwhelmed. "That's a huge task." "Then we must start now," Traoré replied. "One innocent person in jail is one too many." Meanwhile, Emmanuel had begun settling into the presidential guest house, but he didn't feel like a guest. He felt like a stranger in a new world. Everything had changed while he was locked away. The roads were different. Technology had advanced. People spoke faster. Life outside was louder, quicker, and more confusing. One evening, he sat in the garden behind the guest house watching the sunset. A young aide named Joseph approached and offered him a small notebook and a pen. "The president thought you might want to write your story," Joseph said. Emmanuel nodded slowly, then opened the notebook. On the first page, he wrote, "7 years in silence." Then he stared at the words for a long time. The next day, President Traoré invited Emmanuel to a special meeting at the Ministry of Justice. Seated around the large table were senior lawyers, prison officers, and a few representatives from human rights groups. "Today," the president began, "we are going to listen to the unheard." He turned to Emmanuel. "Please speak. They must hear your story." Emmanuel stood slowly. He looked around the room and took a deep breath. "I was 28 when I was arrested. I was accused by the man I had served for 8 years. No one asked for my side. I was beaten. I was forced to sign a confession I didn't write. At the trial, I stood alone. The judge didn't ask me questions. He only read the charges and declared me guilty. I was sent to prison for 15 years. He paused, his voice shaking. "In prison, I lost everything. My wife sent me divorce papers. My children stopped writing. My friends disappeared. I tried to stay strong, but each day felt like dying slowly." The room was silent. Even the most powerful officials couldn't look him in the eye. "I'm not here to blame," Emmanuel continued. "I'm here to ask, how many more people are like me? Who will speak for them?" President Traoré clapped, and soon everyone joined in, not because they were told to, but because they were moved. From that moment, Emmanuel became more than a symbol. He became a voice. The president appointed him as the head of a new committee, the Justice Review Task Force. Their job was to travel around the country, visit prisons, listen to inmates, and find other innocent people who had been forgotten by the system. Their first stop was a prison in Bobo Dioulasso. It was smaller than the central prison in Ouagadougou, but just as overcrowded. Emmanuel, now wearing a white shirt with a badge that read, "Justice for All," walked through the gates with confidence. Inside, he met a man named Isidore, who had been in prison for 12 years. The charge armed robbery, but there were no witnesses, no fingerprints, and the weapon had never been found. "Why are you still here?" Emmanuel asked gently. Isidore looked up with tears. "Because I have no one, and no one believes me." "I believe you," Emmanuel said, the same way President Traoré once said to him. "And I will help you." Back in the capital, President Traoré was working harder than ever. He met with judges, police officials, and legal experts. He ordered training programs to help police understand human rights better. He told judges that rushing cases without proper evidence would no longer be accepted. "This is not a favor," he told them. "It is a duty." In the following weeks, Emmanuel's team found 27 other prisoners who had no clear evidence against them. Some had no case files at all. Others had already completed their sentences but were never released due to errors in documentation. President Traoré took action on every report. He signed releases. He approved retrials. He compensated the wrongly imprisoned. The country watched in awe. Never before had a leader taken such a personal interest in the lives of ordinary people, especially those behind bars. But not everyone was happy. Some powerful men who once controlled the justice system began to complain. "The president is making us look like fools," they said behind closed doors. "He's digging too deep." They didn't know that President Traoré was not afraid. He had made a promise to himself and to Emmanuel that he would not stop until justice reached the deepest corners of the nation. One night, during a national TV interview, the host asked him, "Why did you take this so personally, sir?" The president smiled. "Because justice should never be a privilege for the rich. It should be the right of every citizen, rich or poor, educated or not, free or in prison." Emmanuel reminded me that leadership is not about power. It is about people. That answer made headlines the next morning. Leadership is about people. President Traoré speaks on justice reform. From every region, people began writing letters to the president thanking him. Some shared their own stories, others asked for help, and some just said, "Thank you for listening." But the journey was not over. In a small village near Kaya, a woman wrote a letter. It was short but powerful. "My son was taken by mistake. He has been in prison for 9 years. Please help us." The letter landed on President Traoré's desk just as he finished reading Emmanuel's notebook. He closed the book and whispered, "We're just getting started." The morning breeze in Ouagadougou carried a strange mix of hope and tension. At the presidential office, President Ibrahim Traoré sat at his desk, holding the handwritten letter from the woman in Kaya. Her words were few, but they had weight. "My son was taken by mistake. He has been in prison for 9 years. Please help us." He turned to his aide. "Prepare for a visit to Kaya. Tell Emmanuel to join me." Within hours, a convoy left the capital, heading northeast toward the dusty village. The road was long and rough, but President Traoré didn't complain. Emmanuel sat quietly beside him, holding a small notebook and pen. Since his release, he had taken the habit of recording every case they encountered. "I wonder how many more letters like this we'll get," Emmanuel said. The president nodded. "Until justice lives in every home, we keep moving." By late afternoon, they arrived in Kaya. The village was poor and quiet. The air smelled of dry grass and wood smoke. Children stopped playing when they saw the black cars. Women peeked from their huts, wondering what brought the president of the country to their humble community. An old woman stepped forward slowly. She was barefoot, wearing a faded wrapper and blouse. Her eyes were swollen from crying, but she managed a small bow. "Welcome, Mr. President," she said with trembling hands. "I am the one who wrote the letter." President Traoré walked to her and took her hands in his. "Thank you for writing. Tell me everything." The woman, named Mama Florence, told the story of her only son, Jacob. He was just 19 when he was arrested. A local shop had been robbed, and Jacob was nearby, walking home from work. Because he had no ID and looked nervous, the police took him in. Within 2 days, he was sent to prison without trial, without proof, without a lawyer. "I went to the police station many times," Mama Florence cried. "They told me the case was closed. I sold my goats to pay for transport to the city to look for him, but I was too poor. I gave up. I prayed instead. Emmanuel wrote every word in his notebook. The president placed a hand on the old woman's shoulder. You did the right thing by writing me. We will find Jacob. The convoy left for Kaya Regional Prison immediately. It was a small, crumbling building surrounded by a rusted fence. The prison staff didn't expect visitors, especially not the president of the country. Get me Jacob's file, the president ordered. The prison officer scratched his head. Sir, we don't have a file for a Jacob. What do you mean? Emmanuel asked. Some prisoners were never processed properly, the officer admitted. We only keep paper logs. Some of them are missing. President Traoré's face tightened. Show me the logbook. They brought an old brown book, its pages torn and stained. After flipping through carefully, Emmanuel found an entry, Jacob F., arrested on suspicion of theft. No release date, no trial date, no signature, no follow-up, Emmanuel whispered. He's been buried alive in here. The president stood up sharply. Take me to him. They were led through dark hallways and narrow doors until they reached a small cell in the far corner. Inside, a man sat on the floor, his back against the wall, his beard thick, hair unkempt. He looked up slowly when they entered, his eyes adjusting to the light. Jacob, the president said. The man blinked. Yes. I'm President Ibrahim Traoré. We've come for you. Jacob sat in disbelief. Me? Yes. Your mother wrote to me. At first, Jacob didn't move. His lips trembled. Then tears rolled down his cheeks. He hadn't heard his mother's voice or seen sunlight properly in 9 years. He had given up. Please, he said softly, don't lie to me. I'm not lying, Traoré replied. You are going home. They walked him out of the cell. Every prisoner along the way stared in shock. It wasn't every day a forgotten man was rescued by the president himself. At the gates, Mama Florence was waiting. When Jacob saw her, he froze. Mama, he whispered. My son, she cried, running into his arms. I knew you were alive. I knew. They wept together, and even the guards wiped their eyes. Emmanuel stood close, holding his notebook tightly. It was another story, another life saved from silence. President Traoré called a press briefing right there in Kaya. He held Jacob's old logbook in the air and said, "This is not justice. This is failure. This cannot continue." He announced a new law immediately. Every prisoner must be reviewed within 6 months, no one can be held without proper records, every region must digitize their files within 1 year, any officer found holding innocent people will be investigated and punished. The crowd clapped. Hope was alive again. On their way back to the capital, Emmanuel turned to the president. How did we let this happen for so long? We stopped listening, Traoré answered. That's the danger of power, you begin to hear only the loud and forget the silent. Emmanuel nodded and opened his notebook. At the top of a fresh page, he wrote, "Justice is not given. It is earned and protected." The next day, Jacob was given new clothes, a clean shave, and a hot meal. His mother could not stop smiling. The president gave him a scholarship to return to school and offered his mother a new house in Kaya. As the sun set over the capital, President Traoré looked at a growing pile of letters on his desk, more voices, more cries for justice. And he knew his work had only just begun. The walls of the presidential office in Ouagadougou were no longer just filled with official documents and files. They were now filled with letters of hope. Since the story of Jacob's release, the palace had received thousands of messages. Some were hand-delivered by poor villagers, others came from city lawyers, pastors, market women, and even prison guards. They all shared one message: please listen to our case, too. President Ibrahim Traoré stood before a large map of Burkina Faso with red pins marking every prison in the country. He had added more pins every week. "We need to move faster," he told Emmanuel and the task force. "The people are watching us now. We must not fail them." Emmanuel nodded. "We can form smaller teams and spread out to more regions. We already have trained volunteers." Traoré smiled. "Good. Let's break every chain that was wrongly tied." That same week, the president signed an executive order creating Operation Justice Light, a national campaign to review the cases of long-serving prisoners. Under this operation, every prison in the country would be visited by legal teams, doctors, and human rights officers. The program was launched in Tenkadogo, a town in the central-eastern part of the country. The old prison there had a bad reputation. Inmates were packed like goods, and many had not seen a judge in years. When the team arrived, the warden tried to delay the review. "These men are criminals," he insisted. "They don't deserve freedom." Emmanuel stepped forward. "No one said we are setting criminals free. We're only reviewing the truth." He pointed to a young man in the corner. "What about him?" The warden hesitated. He's been here for 10 years. "I don't remember his case." "Then that's the problem," Emmanuel said. "You kept a man in a cage and forgot his name." The young man's name was Thomas. He had been arrested during a protest. He was only 17 then. His parents had died while he was in custody. He had no lawyer, no trial, no contact with the outside world. President Traoré was sent the report that same night. "Release him," he said without hesitation. "And fire the warden." Within 48 hours, Thomas was free, and the warden was suspended. The operation continued, and the results were shocking. Across 6 prisons, over 200 inmates were found innocent or held without trial. Many had fallen into the cracks of a broken system, poor, forgotten, voiceless. Some had been jailed for crimes as small as stealing bread during a famine. Others were wrongly accused by corrupt landlords or political enemies. At every location, Emmanuel stood tall, representing not just his own story, but the story of the countless innocent men behind bars. His past pain had become his present power. During one meeting at the palace, President Traoré sat with a group of newly released men. "Tell me," he said, "what would you do if given a second chance?" One man replied, "I would become a teacher. I want to help children understand their rights." Another said, "I want a farm. I want to grow food and feed people." Emmanuel smiled at both and said, "Then you must do it and do it well. Let your freedom be louder than your silence." President Traoré decided to go even further. He created the Freedom Restoration Fund, a financial program to support innocent former prisoners with education, housing, and jobs. Many of them have no homes to return to, he told the nation in a televised speech. Their lives were stolen, and we must give back what we can, not as a favor, but as justice. The people cheered. For the first time in decades, the government wasn't just speaking about justice, it was delivering it. Soon, documentaries were made about the campaign. Journalists from outside Africa flew in to witness the prison reforms. International human rights groups praised Burkina Faso for taking bold steps. But with the rising praise came resistance from a few powerful voices. Behind closed doors, some top officials grumbled. This campaign is making the Justice Department look like a failure, one senior judge said. People now think everyone in jail is innocent. Another added, this will encourage more criminals to lie. President Traoré heard of the complaints, but he didn't back down. In a public address, he said, "Let me be clear, justice is not about protecting our pride. It's about correcting our wrongs. If the system is broken, then we must fix it, no matter how uncomfortable it feels." That bold statement silenced many critics. One evening, President Traoré visited the Ouagadougou Central Prison again, this time without media. He wanted to speak with the men personally. As he walked through the same corridor where he once met Emmanuel, he noticed something different: hope. Prisoners greeted him with respect, but also with confidence. They no longer looked like people who had given up. A young man named Salou approached him. "Mr. President, I just want to say thank you. I'm still serving time, but now I believe someone is listening." President Traoré shook his hand and replied, "Everyone deserves a voice, and as long as I'm president, no one will be left in the dark." He turned to the guards and said, "Treat them as human beings. Discipline is good, but cruelty is a failure." Back at the palace, Emmanuel received a message from a man named Austin, a former prosecutor who had once judged over 300 cases. "I want to confess," the letter read. "I was forced to convict some people I wasn't sure were guilty. I want to help you now." Emmanuel took the letter to President Traoré. The president read it and smiled faintly. "Then let him come. It's time for justice to come from both sides, the hurt and the healer." As Operation Justice Light entered its third month, the chains were not just being broken in prison cells, they were being broken in hearts, minds, and laws. And as President Traoré stood once again before the National Assembly, he said boldly, "We are not freeing criminals. We are freeing truth. Let no man sleep peacefully when another man suffers wrongly. Burkina Faso must rise, and it starts with justice." The city of Ouagadougou was buzzing with conversation. From noisy markets to quiet mosques, from school classrooms to radio stations, people were all talking about one thing: President Ibrahim Traoré's justice mission. His bold reforms and prison reviews had inspired hope across the country. Families who had given up on their loved ones now had a reason to believe again. But as Operation Justice Light uncovered more wrongful imprisonments, it also began to rattle deep roots. Some of the names involved in past convictions were powerful judges, politicians, business tycoons. Among them was one name Emmanuel would never forget: Laurent Gira, the man who had falsely accused him 7 years ago. Emmanuel sat in his new office at the Justice Review Task Force, flipping through a list of pending prison cases when he saw the name again: Gira Enterprises complained against 5 former workers. He froze. "It's him," Emmanuel whispered. His assistant looked up. "Who?" The man who destroyed my life. President Traoré was in a meeting when Emmanuel stormed in, holding the file tightly. "I'm sorry for coming in like this, sir," he said, breathing heavily, "but I need you to see this." The president took the file and scanned it. Laurent Gira. "Yes, sir." "He's still doing it, framing innocent people." Traoré frowned. "Why hasn't he been investigated yet?" "He has connections," Emmanuel said bitterly. "That's how he escaped punishment when he accused me. He bribed the judge, paid the police, and now he's doing it again." The president stood slowly. "Then we stop him." That same day, President Traoré called for a special commission to investigate Gira enterprises. Independent lawyers, police officers, and journalists were assigned to the task. Within a week, they uncovered shocking evidence, falsified documents, fake witness reports, and several complaints from past employees who had been wrongly jailed and silenced. One former security guard, Pascal, had spent 4 years in prison after being blamed for a theft he didn't commit. "They told me to sign a confession or they'd kill my wife," Pascal said during the investigation. "I was scared, so I signed." Another worker, Awa, was locked up for 3 years just for speaking out against the company's illegal labor practices. When President Traoré read the final report, he shook his head in disbelief. This man has built his empire on the pain of others. He called a press conference and announced, "We are now going after those who use the justice system for personal gain. The days of bribery and fake accusations are over." Laurent Gira was arrested the next morning. News of his arrest shocked the country. He had once been praised as a successful businessman, a pillar of the economy. Now he stood in handcuffs, accused of destroying lives for profit. Emmanuel watched it all quietly from the side. He didn't cheer. He didn't cry. He just felt a strange peace inside, a pain finally lifted. "Justice," he whispered. At last. During the trial, Gira refused to speak at first. But as witnesses came forward and documents were shown in court, the truth became undeniable. The judge, the same one who had once convicted Emmanuel, was also called in for questioning. Under pressure and public scrutiny, the judge confessed. "Yes," he admitted, "I took money. I was promised promotion. I failed the law. I failed the people." That day, the courtroom was packed. Emmanuel sat in the front row beside President Traoré. The entire nation was watching. The judge turned to Emmanuel. "I ruined your life," he said. "I don't ask for forgiveness. I only ask that you never let this happen again to anyone." Emmanuel stood up slowly. His voice was steady. "You took 7 years from me, but you taught me something: justice must be protected, not by the powerful, but by the brave." The courtroom erupted in applause. The final ruling came 2 days later. Laurent Gira was sentenced to 18 years in prison. The judge who convicted Emmanuel was dismissed and stripped of his honors. Victims like Pascal and Awa were compensated. And Emmanuel, he was finally declared a man of honor by the National Assembly. President Traoré gave a speech at the assembly after the trial. "This is a new dawn," he said. "Let the powerful know your titles will not shield you from justice, and let the poor know you are not invisible. We see you, we hear you, and we will fight for you." Across Burkina Faso, the people rejoiced. For the first time in generations, justice was not just a word, it was an action, a movement. Emmanuel, now known as the voice of the voiceless, was invited to speak at universities, conferences, and schools. He traveled across the country, teaching young people about their rights, the law, and the power of standing for truth. But he remained humble. "I am not a hero," he often said. "I am just one of many. My story could have been forgotten, but someone listened, and that changed everything." One afternoon, after another long day of work, Emmanuel visited the prison where it all started. He walked through the old corridors and met with inmates still serving their time. "Don't lose hope," he told them. "Your voice matters. Keep speaking. Someone will hear you." That evening, President Traoré called Emmanuel. "There's more work ahead," he said. "The justice system is like a garden. If we stop caring for it, weeds will grow again." Emmanuel nodded on the phone. "Then we must keep planting seeds of truth." And so, the mission continued, not just to free the wrongly accused, but to rebuild a nation where justice lived in every home, every village, and every heart. 1 year had passed since President Ibrahim Traoré stepped into that dusty prison and met Emmanuel, the man with sad eyes and a quiet spirit. Burkina Faso was no longer the same. The justice system had been shaken, cleaned, and reborn. But perhaps the greatest transformation was not in the laws or the prisons, but in the heart of one man who was once forgotten by the world. Emmanuel was no longer just a name in a dusty prison logbook. He had become a national voice, a teacher, and a partner in governance. President Traoré saw in him something rare: humility mixed with strength, pain turned into power. One morning, at a private breakfast in the palace, the president leaned forward and said, "I have one final proposal for you, Emmanuel. I want you to become special advisor on national justice and human rights. You will work directly with me, not just for prisoners, but for every voiceless citizen in this country." Emmanuel was stunned. "Mr. President, I don't have the education for such a role." Traoré smiled. "You have something better: experience, truth, and a heart for people. That's what real leadership needs." Emmanuel accepted the role with tears in his eyes. Within weeks, he moved into a new office next to the president's and began building a national program that would educate citizens in villages and towns about their legal rights. He also created a support line where families could report injustice without fear. His idea was simple: justice must start before prison, not after it. He traveled to rural communities, often by foot or motorcycle, listening to stories under mango trees and in dusty classrooms. He met grandmothers who still waited for sons to return, wives who never knew where their husbands were taken, and orphans who had been punished for crimes they didn't commit. "Let me be your voice," Emmanuel would say. "Tell me everything." In return, he gave them something even more powerful: hope. Meanwhile, President Traoré was receiving international praise for his unprecedented reform. Leaders from across Africa visited to learn about Burkina Faso's prison audit model. Human rights organizations applauded the bravery it took to expose internal corruption. But the president remained humble. "I didn't do it alone," he said in an interview. "I was led by a man the world once ignored. Now he leads with me." On the first anniversary of Operation Justice Light, a national event was held in the Capitol Stadium. The president and Emmanuel stood before thousands. Around them were hundreds of former prisoners who had been freed and supported back into society. Each one wore a white sash with the words, "Justice Restored." One by one, they stepped forward to share how their lives had changed. Some had opened farms, others had become mechanics, teachers, and community leaders. They were no longer marked by their time in prison, but by what they became after. Emmanuel gave the closing speech. He stood quietly for a moment, looking out at the sea of faces. Then he spoke. "I once thought my life was over. I once thought silence was my only companion. But today, I stand here not as a victim, but as a partner in rebuilding justice. I forgive those who hurt me. I thank the one who listened. And I challenge every one of you, listen to the unheard, stand for the unseen, speak for the voiceless. Because justice is not a luxury, it is a right. And together, we must protect it." The stadium erupted in cheers. Tears flowed freely. That night, people across Burkina Faso lit candles in their homes, celebrating Justice Day for the first time in the nation's history. Back in the palace, President Traoré and Emmanuel sat in quiet reflection. "You've done well," the president said. "No," Emmanuel replied, smiling, "we have done well." And in that silence, two men, once separated by position and pain, sat as equals, not as president and prisoner, but as brothers in purpose, bound by truth. The next morning, Emmanuel returned to his old cell at Ouagadougou Central Prison, not as a prisoner, but as a guest of honor. The cell had been left empty and untouched since his release. It now had a plaque that read, "This cell once held a man who the world forgot, but it also held the spark that set justice free." And with that, Emmanuel closed the cell door gently behind him, stepped into the sunlight, and walked into a future he never thought he'd see. The chains were broken. The truth had come out. And Burkina Faso would never be the same again. Dear viewers, if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the subscribe button, like, share with your friends, and turn on the post notification bell so you'll be the first to know whenever we upload a new video on Black struggles. Thank you for watching.